It makes absolute sense to assume that if something truly world-altering happens in front of multiple witnesses, every single one of those witnesses will remember it, document it, and pass it down through history. Any rational person would naturally reach that conclusion without needing to think twice. If you are standing in a dusty crowd in the ancient world and you witness a man defying the fundamental laws of biology and nature, you write it down. It becomes the defining moment of your entire account. From our earliest childhoods, we are taught that the four Gospels of the New Testament act as a perfectly harmonized chorus. We are repeatedly told that they tell the exact same core narrative of Jesus of Nazareth, with each writer adding their own slight variations or specific thematic emphases, but essentially agreeing on the major earth-shattering beats of his life and ministry. And everyone knows the story of Lazarus. It is the definitive miracle. A man dead for 4 days. A body already tightly wrapped in heavy burial cloths, sealed firmly behind a massive stone in the quiet village of Bethany, already beginning to succumb to the harsh, irreversible reality of physical decay. A weeping family surrounding the tomb, a crowd of desperate onlookers waiting to see what happens next, and then a single command that shatters the boundary between the living and the dead, reversing death itself. It is universally considered the greatest miracle Jesus ever performed, the absolute climax of his earthly ministry, the undeniable ultimate proof of his divinity that ultimately forced the religious authorities to act and set the final fatal events of his life into motion. That is the first layer. The obvious truth that you have likely accepted without question for your entire life. The problem is that there are exactly 3 layers beneath this comfortable surface. And the final layer, the one hiding at the very core of this narrative, is the one nobody wants to talk about. Because when you step away from the pulpit, close your eyes to the traditional interpretations, and look closely at the actual historical texts, you are hit by a silence that is absolutely deafening. Matthew did not write a single word about Lazarus. Mark never mentioned him. Luke completely forgot him. 3 out of 4 biographers, supposedly relying on direct eyewitness testimony, writing decades before the final Gospel of John was ever circulated, completely and utterly ignored the single greatest miracle their teacher ever performed. They meticulously document him healing fevers. They carefully record him multiplying bread for the crowds. They make sure to mention him walking on water or calming a sudden storm on the sea. But a man dead for 4 days, called out of a tomb in front of a crowd of witnesses, a man who proved that death itself could be conquered? Absolute unbroken silence. The question is not just how 3 ancient historians managed to forget a resurrected man. The question is what their collective silence is actually hiding from you. We are conditioned from birth to believe that history is a solid, unmoving object. We think of it as a ledger where every significant event is meticulously recorded in ink that never fades. When we approach texts like the Gospels, we bring this modern bureaucratic assumption with us. We expect the writers to function like modern journalists, armed with notepads, cross-checking their sources, and ensuring that no major detail is ever left behind. But the ancient world did not operate on this principle. The ancient world operated on memory, on oral tradition, and on the specific urgent needs of the present moment. When an ancient writer set out to construct a narrative, they were not trying to satisfy the curiosity of a historian sitting in a library 2,000 years in the future. They were trying to keep their immediate community from falling apart. They were writing to provide theological meaning to a terrifying and confusing reality. And in that context, the facts of history are often secondary to the truth of the theology. This fundamental misunderstanding of how ancient texts were created is exactly why the silence surrounding Lazarus feels so utterly jarring. We expect a complete medical and historical record, and instead, we are given a theological argument. But if you look closer, it is not exactly as simple as a forgotten memory or a clumsy omission. That is the first layer peeled back. The immediate reaction of any modern reader encountering this gaping hole is to cry foul. The skeptic points to this massive absence and declares that if raising someone who had been dead for 4 days actually happened, it is mathematically and logically impossible for the other 3 biographers to completely forget to include it in their accounts. It feels like a massive plot hole in the very foundation of the biblical text, a glaring error that unravels the entire narrative. But history does not work the way we think it works. We project our modern anxieties onto ancient texts. A historian named Frances Wood demonstrated this perfectly when she published a comprehensive book in 1995 asking a very simple but provocative question about Marco Polo and his famous journey to China. The skeptics had long argued that Marco Polo never actually visited the East because his incredibly detailed travelogue completely failed to mention the Great Wall of China. To the modern mind, it seemed entirely impossible to visit that region, spend years documenting the culture, the trade, and the geography, and somehow completely miss the largest man-made structure on Earth. It was an argument from silence, and it looked absolutely devastating to Marco Polo's credibility. But later, historians dismantled this skeptical argument completely. They showed that the massive, continuous stone wall we know today did not even exist during the era when Marco Polo was traveling. The omission of a massive fact was not a hole in the historical text, but a flaw in our modern expectations. We expect ancient writers to care about the things we care about today. We expect them to document reality like a modern camera, capturing every detail in the background. They simply did not do that. History is always filtered through the specific, narrow focus of the person holding the pen. Consider the commanding general of the Union Army during the American Civil War. He wrote an incredibly detailed, exhaustive memoir of the conflict in the late 19th century. He was the man in charge. He knew every tactical movement, every political shift, every casualty report. Yet, in his massive, comprehensive memoirs, he completely omitted any mention of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most significant political and moral documents in human history, signed during the very war he fought and won, and he simply left it out of his story. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that even primary eyewitnesses routinely omit massively significant historical events if those events fall outside their specific narrative focus or personal agenda. And this changes exactly how we look at the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not writing comprehensive encyclopedic biographies designed to satisfy modern historians. They were writing geographically focused theological narratives. Their primary focus was the ministry of Jesus in the northern region of Galilee. But the resurrection of Lazarus occurred in Bethany, a small village in Judea, right on the doorstep of Jerusalem. The synoptic writers focused their lenses on the north, while John focused heavily on the southern Judean ministry. They did not forget Lazarus. He simply did not happen in the geographical territory they were primarily documenting. The silence was just a matter of editorial focus. History is messy, and human biographers leave things out all the time. You realize that your initial shock was perhaps just a modern misunderstanding of ancient historiography, and you begin to settle back into a comfortable understanding of the text. But this argument from silence goes even deeper than Marco Polo or the American Civil War. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality of how human memory is actually constructed and preserved. When we assume that the three synoptic writers simply must have known about Lazarus because the event was so massive, we are projecting a modern, hyper-connected understanding of information onto a fragmented, disconnected ancient world. In the first century, information did not travel instantaneously. It traveled by word of mouth, carried by merchants, soldiers, and wandering teachers along dusty, dangerous roads. A massive event could happen in Judea and remain completely unknown to a community forming in the northern regions of Galilee for decades. The Gospel of Mark, which most historians agree was the very first narrative to be written down, was likely composed in Rome or Syria, far removed from the immediate local memory of Bethany. Matthew and Luke built their narratives largely upon the foundation of Mark. If Mark did not know the story, or if Mark chose to omit the story because it did not fit his specific theological framework, then Matthew and Luke would also inherit that silence. The silence of the three is not necessarily a conspiracy, and it is not necessarily proof that the event never happened. It is proof that early Christianity was not a monolithic, unified movement with a single, agreed-upon history. It was a chaotic, fractured collection of different communities, each preserving their own specific traditions, their own specific memories, and their own specific theological priorities. The writers of the Synoptic Gospels were not concerned with recording a comprehensive history. They were concerned with surviving the present moment and preparing for the end of the world. In that context, you do not write down everything. You write down only what is absolutely necessary for the survival of your specific community. Because of this, the question seems completely resolved. You breathe a deep sigh of relief. The text is safe. The silence is just a geographical technicality, a quirk of ancient editing. But wait, that is not the worst part. The second layer changes the frame completely, and it is significantly more uncomfortable than a simple editorial choice based on geography. The omission of the greatest miracle was not a geographical accident. It was an intentional, calculated cover-up. A prominent scholar named Richard Bauckham proposed a framework that changes how we read every single word of the New Testament. It is called protective anonymity. You have to understand the sheer political terror of first-century Judea. The Gospels were not written in a peaceful academic vacuum by men sitting in quiet libraries. They were underground documents produced by a persecuted, hunted movement that was actively being suppressed by the most powerful empire on earth and the local religious authorities. If you read the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 12, verse 10, you find a terrifying, easily overlooked detail. The chief priests did not just plot to kill Jesus, they actively plotted to kill Lazarus as well. Lazarus was living, walking, breathing proof of a power that threatened the entire religious and political establishment of the day. He was a marked man, a walking target for assassination. The earlier writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were writing their accounts while the events were still fresh, while the authorities were still actively hunting down the followers of this radical movement. If you are writing an underground document to circulate among the persecuted, you do not publish the name and location of the most wanted man in Jerusalem. You practice protective anonymity. You actively omit his name. You completely omit his miracle. You hide him in the absolute silence of the text in order to keep him alive. John, on the other hand, wrote his gospel decades later, near the very end of the first century. By the time John put ink to parchment, the immediate danger had passed. The temple in Jerusalem had fallen, the specific authorities that hunted them were dead, and Lazarus himself was almost certainly long gone, resting in a tomb he would not leave a second time. John could safely name him. John could safely tell the story that the others were forced by the threat of violence to suppress. I know this theory intimately. I spent years standing in front of crowded lecture halls teaching the protective anonymity theory to young, eager students. I remember the weight of the chalk in my hand, the quiet hum of the room, as I explained how the silence of the texts was actually a noble act of espionage and protection. It was such a brilliant, elegant solution. It made the silence of the earlier Gospels seem heroic. It turned a glaring plot hole into a thrilling story of early Christian survival. I taught it with absolute conviction because it protected my own understanding of the texts as much as it supposedly protected Lazarus. Sitting in a local library recently, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, watching the autumn rain wash against the window glass, I thought about those lectures. And I realized why I had clung to the protective anonymity theory so fiercely for all those years. I clung to it because the alternative was simply too devastating to consider. The second layer tells you that the text is profoundly shaped by political terror. It tells you that the silence was a desperate shield used by frightened men. It makes you feel like an insider, finally understanding the secret codes of a hunted people. But it is still a defense mechanism. It is still a way to avoid looking at the absolute bottom of the well. This is why the protective anonymity theory is so incredibly seductive. It takes the terrifying silence of the text and turns it into a heroic virtue. It allows us to believe that the omissions were not errors, but acts of profound moral courage. We want to believe that the silence was a shield, protecting the vulnerable from the crushing power of the Roman Empire and the temple authorities. But the more you lean on this theory, the more you realize how fragile it truly is. If the synoptic writers were so terrified of the authorities that they completely erased the greatest miracle from the historical record to protect Lazarus, why did they not erase the names of the other people they wrote about? Why did they name Peter, who famously cut off a man's ear during the arrest in the garden? Why did they name Mary Magdalene, who was a prominent and highly visible follower? The selective nature of the protective anonymity theory begins to look less like a historical reality and more like an apologetic convenience. We use it to patch the holes in the ship because we are terrified of what happens if the ship actually sinks. I spent decades teaching this theory precisely because it allowed me to avoid the one question that kept me awake at night. If the protective anonymity theory is wrong, if they did not omit the story to protect a living man, then why is the silence there? The academic shield was a way of preventing myself from looking down into the dark, empty space where the foundation of the story was supposed to be. Before we descend into that final uncomfortable truth, there is something you need to know. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand the philosophical frameworks that actually force us to look at these ancient texts without the protective shields we constantly build around them, look at the pinned comment below this video. The Spinoza Archive Library, a 5-volume collection, is detailed there. It is the foundation for reading history without flinching, and it provides the exact tools needed to strip away the comfortable illusions we have inherited. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. This is the third layer, the one nobody wants to hear, the one that makes the elegant theories of protective anonymity crumble into dust. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza argued something that completely shattered the theological world of his time, and it remains deeply unsettling today. Spinoza argued in his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus that nature is governed by immutable, unbreakable divine laws. He demanded that we must read Scripture not as a magical incantation dropped fully formed from the sky, but as a deeply historical, profoundly human document written by men with very specific, very human theological agendas. When you apply Spinoza's lens to the story of Lazarus, the protective anonymity theory starts to crack under the pressure. It is a beautiful theory, yes, but it relies entirely on one massive assumption that we are desperate to keep intact. It assumes that the event literally, historically, happened exactly as described, and was merely hidden from the public record to protect a living man. But what if the silence of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is not a geographical accident? What if it is not a noble cover-up to protect a hunted man from the authorities? What if their silence is exactly what it looks like? They never mentioned the resurrection of Lazarus because they had absolutely no idea it had ever happened, and they had no idea it had happened because it was not a historical event for them to record in the first place. The silence of the three is not an omission. It is a deafening statement of absence. In the Gospel of Luke, there is a very famous parable told by Jesus, a purely fictional story used to make a moral point about wealth and suffering. It is the parable of a rich man and a poor, covered in sores beggar. The beggar dies and goes to the comforting bosom of Abraham. The rich man dies and goes to eternal torment. The rich man begs Abraham to send the beggar back from the dead to warn his living brothers about the consequences of their actions. And Abraham replies with a chilling truth, stating that even if someone rises from the dead, they will not believe. Do you know the name of the fictional beggar in that parable in Luke? His name is Lazarus. It is the only time in the entire span of the Synoptic Gospels that a character in a parable is given a specific identifying name. Decades later, John writes his gospel. John has a very specific towering theological architecture to build. He needs to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that Jesus is not just a prophet, not just a moral teacher, but the literal incarnate Word of God with absolute unyielding power over life and death itself. John takes the fictional beggar from Luke's parable. He gives him a concrete hometown in Bethany. He gives him two grieving sisters, Mary and Martha, and he literally raises him from the dead in the narrative. The parable becomes history. The metaphor becomes flesh. Go back for a second to that phrase from the very beginning, the greatest miracle of Jesus. Now you see what it was hiding. You see exactly why it was universally accepted as the greatest. It was the greatest miracle because it absolutely had to be. It was the architectural keystone of John's entire theology. It was not a memory retrieved from the dusty past. It was a narrative constructed to hold up the future of the church. The silence of the three was not a failure of memory, nor was it a protective cover-up. It was the silence of men who did not yet know the theological architecture that John was going to build decades later. The silence was the truth. When you read Spinoza, you do not just lose a comforting theory. You lose the entire architectural framework that makes the comforting theory possible in the first place. Spinoza's argument that the biblical texts are human documents, shaped by human political and theological needs, forces us to re-examine everything. If the Gospel of John is not a historical record, but a theological architecture, then the resurrection of Lazarus is not a medical event that was miraculously reversed. It is a literary and theological climax constructed to prove a specific point about the nature of the divine. The author of John's Gospel was writing at a time when the early Christian community was actively splitting away from the traditional synagogue. They were experiencing a profound traumatic rupture in their religious identity. They needed a narrative that definitively, absolutely proved that their path was the true path, and that their teacher was not just a misunderstood rabbi, but the pre-existent Word of God. To build that narrative, they needed a miracle that surpassed all other miracles. They needed an event that could not be explained away as a parlor trick, a misunderstanding, or a minor healing. They needed a man 4 days dead, stinking of decay in a sealed tomb, called back into the light of day. They needed Lazarus. The fact that Lazarus previously existed only as a fictional character in a moral parable told by Luke is the key that unlocks the entire architecture. John did not just borrow a name, he borrowed a concept. In Luke's parable, the rich man is told that even if someone rises from the dead, the people will not believe. John takes that theological premise and turns it into a historical narrative. He writes the story of Lazarus rising from the dead to prove the point. Even when a man is raised from the tomb, the authorities still do not believe. Instead, they plot to kill him. The narrative of John is a brilliant, towering theological construction built upon the foundation of a parable, designed to explain the trauma and the separation of the early church. It is a masterpiece of ancient literature, but it is not a historical memory. And this is exactly why you feel that strange, unsettling weight in your chest when you finally realize what the silence actually means. Because it is not just about ancient texts or first-century Judea or the literary techniques of ancient biographers. It is about how we construct our own realities. I walk through the cold, damp streets of East Anglia feeling the bite of the autumn wind, and I think about the profound, heavy things we leave out of our own stories. You probably do this without even realizing it. You have a carefully constructed narrative about your life, about your family, about your past, about the choices you have made. And there are massive foundational truths that you simply do not speak aloud. You omit them completely. Not because you forgot them, not always, because you are actively trying to protect someone else from pain. You omit them because if you spoke them aloud, the entire theological architecture of your own life would collapse in an instant. We all have a Gospel of John in our heads, a narrative we have constructed perfectly to prove that our suffering had undeniable meaning, that our choices were somehow divine, that our painful path was absolutely necessary. And we all have the silent synoptic Gospels buried underneath, the messy, unedited, contradictory reality that we refuse to document or acknowledge. We build our own miracles to cover up the silence. We construct elaborate, beautiful stories to explain away the terrifying gaps in our own history. The silence was never an oversight. It was the architecture. The things you do not say are the load-bearing walls of your entire identity. You were completely right to question the silence in the text. You were only wrong about what the silence was actually protecting. It was not protecting a man in a tomb from the chief priests. It was protecting the very idea of the divine from the messy reality of human history. And the moment you see the architecture for what it really is, you can never unsee it. The silence is no longer an empty space in the record. It is the loudest part of the room. And this architectural silence extends far beyond the pages of an ancient manuscript. It bleeds into the very way we interact with the world around us today. Think about the institutions you trust, the communities you belong to, the relationships that define your everyday existence. Every single one of them is built upon a foundation of selective memory and intentional omission. We do not just do this individually, we do this collectively. Entire nations build their historical narratives by carefully curating the events that make them look heroic and systematically omitting the events that reveal their cruelty. We celebrate the victories, and we bury the atrocities in the footnotes of textbooks. We create a Gospel of John for our national identity, complete with magnificent, undeniable miracles of progress and exceptionalism, while simultaneously burying the synoptic Gospels that tell the messy, uncomfortable, contradictory truth of how that progress was actually achieved. The silence is not a mistake. It is the very glue that holds the community together. If we were forced to look at the complete, unedited historical record, if every single omission was suddenly spoken aloud, the architecture of our society would buckle under the weight of the contradictions. We require the silence in order to function. We demand the cover-up in order to feel safe. And when someone like Spinoza comes along and points out the gaping holes in the narrative, our first instinct is not to thank him for the truth, but to burn the book and excommunicate the author. We prefer the beautifully constructed miracle over the terrifying, empty silence. If you have made it down to this final layer, and this kind of relentless investigation means something to you, then consider subscribing to the channel. The algorithm only shows the next layers to those who actively signal that they want to see more. And in our upcoming investigations, the texts become even more demanding, and the silence becomes even more uncomfortable. The subscription is just a signal that you are ready to keep digging beneath the surface. And before you go, leave a comment below. I want to know your genuine reaction. Did you believe the obvious truth in the first layer? Or did the silence of the three Gospels always bother you deep down? Let me know exactly which layer actually made you question the narrative.